She claimed my body and my loyalty in the precise moment the heavy oak front door slammed shut downstairs, echoing like a gunshot through the silent mansion, and I will never forget the way she pressed my trembling hand against her bare waist while my father's angry footsteps began to thunder up the grand staircase. It wasn't just a seduction, it was a mutiny. I was 24, a fresh graduate living in the guest wing of my father's sprawling estate, trying to secure a future in his company. Isabella was 40, the stunning, trophy's wife's stepmother I had spent 3 weeks trying desperately not to look at. But on the night of the foundation gala, in the soft, golden light of the master bedroom, the boundaries of our family were dissolved by the friction of silk against skin and a zipper that refused to close. The evening had started with the usual chaotic symphony of my father's temper. Richard, a man who commanded boardrooms but couldn't manage his own patience, was already in the driveway, revving the engine of the limousine and shouting into his phone. "Isabella, if you aren't down here in 2 minutes, I'm leaving you behind." His voice boomed up the stairwell. I was standing in the hallway, adjusting my tie, when I heard a soft crash from the master suite, followed by a stifled sob. Against my better judgment, I walked to the double doors and pushed them open. The room smelled of expensive hairspray, jasmine perfume, and palpable distress. Isabella was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling vanity mirror, wearing an emerald green backless gown that looked like liquid money. Her hands were clutching the fabric at her hips, her knuckles white. She looked at me through the mirror, her eyes wide and wet with tears. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't do it. My hands are shaking too much." I should have called the housekeeper. I should have told her to hurry up and walked away. But seeing her so vulnerable, stripped of her usual confident armor, pulled me into the room like a magnet. "It's okay," I said, my voice lower than usual. "Let me help." I walked up behind her. The dress was designed to be provocative, plunging dangerously low in the back, held together by a single, delicate invisible zipper that ran from the small of her back to her neck. She dropped her hands, letting the bodice hang loose, exposing the smooth, pale curve of her spine and the faint indentation of her ribs. "He's going to kill me," she murmured, trembling. "He hates being late." I reached out, my fingers brushing against her warm skin as I found the zipper pull. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to my gut. Her skin was incredibly soft, radiating a heat that seemed to defy the air-conditioned chill of the house. "Hold still," I murmured, trying to keep my hands steady. The zipper was stuck. A thread of the delicate silk lining had caught in the teeth right at the curve of her waist. I leaned in closer, my breath hitching as I realized just how intimate this position was. I was standing directly behind my father's wife, struggling with her dress, inhaling her scent. I tugged gently, trying to free the fabric. My knuckles grazed the sensitive skin of her lower back, and she let out a sharp, audible intake of breath. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned back, just a fraction of an inch, pressing her body against my chest. It was subtle, barely a movement, but the message was deafening. I looked up into the mirror and found her watching me. Her gaze wasn't panicked anymore. It was dark, searching, and hungry. "He hasn't looked at me in months, Daniel," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine in the glass reflection. "He looks at his watch. He looks at his phone. But he never looks at me. Not the way you're looking at me right now." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I froze, my hand still resting on the small of her back. I wanted to deny it, to say I was just being a dutiful stepson, but the lie wouldn't form. I was looking. I had been looking since the day I moved back in. "Isabella, I started, but the words died in my throat. The zipper finally gave way, sliding up an inch, but I didn't finish the job. I couldn't. The tension in the room had shifted from anxiety to something far more dangerous. The air felt thick, charged with a static that made the hair on my arm stand up. Then, the front door slammed downstairs. The sound was violent, shaking the crystal chandelier above us. "Isabella, I am coming up there." Richard's voice roared, closer now. He was in the foyer. Heavy, angry footsteps began to pound on the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. Panic flared in my chest. "He's coming," I hissed, quickly trying to yank the zipper up to her neck to cover her, to hide the evidence of our prolonged intimacy. "We have to go." But she stopped me. In a move that defied all logic and self-preservation, Isabella reached behind her and grabbed my wrist. She didn't let me finish zipping the dress. Instead, she forced my hand down, pressing my palm flat against her bare waist, trapping it between her body and the loose fabric of the gown. She turned her head slightly, her lips parting, her eyes blazing with a reckless desperation. We could hear Richard reaching the landing, his breathing heavy, his muttering audible. He was 10 seconds away from the open door. "Don't finish it," she whispered fiercely, gripping my hand tighter against her skin, making me an accomplice to her rebellion. "Pretend you're struggling. But don't you dare stop touching me." The transition from the volatile atmosphere of the bedroom to the hermetically sealed quiet of the limousine felt like stepping from a frying pan into a freezer. My father, Richard, had barely glanced at Isabella's dress, the dress that had nearly been the catalyst for a catastrophe just moments before burying his face in his tablet, barking orders at an assistant through his Bluetooth earpiece. The divider between the driver and the passenger cabin was down, a clear sheet of glass that offered no privacy, and the city lights blurred past us in streaks of neon and rain. We were seated in a tense triangle. Richard occupied the forward-facing power seat, a throne of black leather from which he commanded his empire, while Isabella and I sat on the long J-shaped bench seat. We were technically sitting apart, separated by a foot of expensive upholstery, but the air between us was so charged it felt solid. Isabella sat with her legs crossed, the high slit of her emerald gown falling open just enough to reveal the smooth, pale skin of her thigh, illuminated intermittently by the passing street lamps. She had draped a heavy cashmere shawl over her lap to ward off the chill of the air conditioning, creating a dark, private tent that concealed the lower half of her body from my father's view. As the car merged onto the highway, Richard finally looked up, though his eyes looked through us rather than at us. "Daniel," he said, his voice clipped and professional, as if we were in a boardroom rather than en route to a charity gala. "I need you to charm the Sterling account tonight. He's old-fashioned. He likes young blood with ambition. Don't disappoint me." I nodded, trying to force my voice to sound steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "I'll handle it, sir," I replied. Isabella shifted beside me. She didn't look at Richard. She was looking straight ahead, her profile sharp and angry, but her hand moved. Under the cover of the cashmere shawl, she reached out across the small gap between us. Her fingers brushed my knuckles, a feather-like touch that sent a shockwave straight up my arm. I flinched, instinctively checking to see if Richard had noticed, but he was already back to scrolling through emails. Emboldened by his neglect, Isabella didn't retreat. She grabbed my hand firmly, her grip hot and desperate, and pulled it under the shawl. The sensation of the hidden world beneath that fabric was overwhelming. It was a pocket of intense heat and forbidden softness, isolated from the cold, sterile luxury of the car. Isabella guided my hand to her knee, pressing my palm flat against her skin. The silk of her dress had ridden up, leaving her leg bare. My breath hitched in my throat. I should have pulled away. I should have engaged my father in conversation about quarterly earnings or market trends, anything to sever this connection. But I didn't. I looked at her, and for the briefest second, she turned her head, her eyes locking onto mine with a challenge that was both terrifying and irresistible. "He doesn't care," her eyes said. "So why should we?" I relaxed my fingers, my hand molding to the curve of her thigh. Her skin was incredibly soft, and I could feel the slight tremor in her muscles, the same shaking I had felt upstairs. But this wasn't fear anymore, it was anticipation. Slowly, recklessly, I began to move my thumb, tracing the line of her inner thigh, inching upward toward the dangerous hem of the split skirt. "Isabella, did you remember to call the donors about the silent auction?" Richard asked suddenly, his voice booming in the quiet cabin. The sound was so jarring I nearly jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs. My hand froze instantly on her leg, gripping her tight. Isabella didn't even blink. She maintained her composure with a terrifying grace, her voice smooth and cool as she answered him. "It's handled, Richard. Unlike you, I don't leave things to the last minute." While she spoke to her husband with icy detachment, her body was communicating something entirely different to me. She shifted her legs slightly, widening the space between them, a silent invitation for me to continue. It was a dizzying duality, the public performance of the dutiful wife and the private rebellion of the lover. I slid my hand higher, my fingertips grazing the sheer fabric of her underwear, feeling the heat radiating from her. We were playing Russian roulette with our lives. The driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds. My father was 3 feet away. If the shawl slipped, if Richard dropped his gaze, if the interior light suddenly flickered on, my life would be over. Then, the car lurched violently. A taxi cut us off in the rain, and the driver slammed on the brakes. The momentum threw us all forward. The tablet slipped from Richard's hands, sliding off his lap and clattering onto the floor of the limo, sliding directly toward where Isabella and I were sitting. "Damn it!" Richard cursed, unbuckling his seatbelt. He leaned forward, reaching down between his feet, his head dipping lower, his eyes scanning the floor. My hand was still buried deep under the shawl, high on Isabella's thigh, entangled in the silk of her dress. If he looked up, if he followed the trajectory of the device to where it had stopped near her feet, he would see the unnatural angle of my arm disappearing under her wrap. I tried to withdraw, to yank my hand back, but Isabella clamped her legs together, trapping my hand in place. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and a twisted thrill, daring me to stay put, daring me to hold my ground while the predator was inches away from the nest. The Grand Opera House was a suffocating cage of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and hollow laughter, filled with the city's elite pretending to care about the arts while sizing up each other's net worth. My father, Richard, didn't waste a second. As soon as we were ushered into our private VIP box, a plush, velvet-lined balcony overlooking the stage, he spotted a senator he needed to bribe or charm and vanished into the crowded corridor, leaving Isabella and me alone in the semi-darkness. The performance hadn't started yet, but the orchestra was tuning up, a chaotic rising swell of strings that matched the turmoil in my gut. Isabella stood by the railing, looking down at the sea of tuxedos and gowns, her back stiff, her emerald dress catching the light. She looked like a queen without a king, isolated and furious. She turned to me, her face pale, the mask of the perfect wife slipping entirely. "He didn't even introduce me," she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "He treats me like a prop, a mannequin to stand next to him in photos." She stepped back from the railing, retreating into the shadows of the box where the heavy, crimson velvet curtain separated us from the main hall. "I can't breathe out there, Daniel. It's too loud. Come here." It wasn't a request. She pulled me into the small, dimly lit antechamber behind the main seating area, a narrow space hidden from the public eye by the thick folds of the curtain. The air here was cooler, smelling of old dust and expensive perfume. As soon as the curtain swished shut, cutting off the view of the stage, the atmosphere shifted from public humiliation to private desperation. Isabella didn't wait. She pushed me back against the velvet-covered wall, her hands planting firmly on my chest. "You saw him," she hissed, her eyes searching mine in the gloom. "You saw how he looked right through me. Does he think I'm invisible? He's a fool, Isabella," I answered, the words tumbling out before I could check them. "You're the only thing worth looking at in this entire building." The confession hung in the air, raw and undeniable. Isabella's expression softened, shifting from anger to a dangerous, predatory gratitude. "Then look," she breathed, stepping closer until her body was pressed against mine, hip to hip, chest to chest. "Don't just say it, Daniel. Show me." The tension that had been building in the car exploded. We were standing in a semi-public box, with 3,000 people just on the other side of a curtain, but in that shadow, we were alone. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of my neck, and pulled my mouth down to hers. The kiss was aggressive, a reclaiming of power. She tasted of champagne and rebellion. My hands found her waist, instinctively seeking the zipper I had failed to close earlier. It was still slightly lowered, hidden by her hair, a secret access point that only I knew about. I slid my fingers under the fabric, touching the bare skin of her spine, and she gasped into my mouth, arching her back. The orchestra began to play the overture, the booming timpani and soaring violins masking the sound of our breathing. It was a dizzying rush of adrenaline. We were desecrating the sanctity of my father's social standing, risking a scandal that would be printed on the front page of every paper in the city, and the danger only made the attraction burn hotter. I pulled her closer, my hand sliding down to the curve of her hip, possessive and reckless. "Isabella," I whispered, breaking the kiss to gasp for air, my forehead resting against hers. There are photographers everywhere. If someone comes in, let them come, she challenged, though she kept her voice to a husk. Let him see what he's losing. But she knew the stakes as well as I did. She turned me slightly, positioning herself so that if the curtain opened, I would shield her body from view. It was a calculated move, a recognition that while she wanted to burn the house down, she didn't want to die in the fire. She took my hand and guided it to the high slit of her dress again, recreating the scene from the limousine, but this time there was no barrier. Touch me, she commanded softly. Make me forget where I am. I obeyed, lost in the sensory overload of the music, the velvet, and her heat. Suddenly, the heavy curtain rings rattled violently overhead. A flash of light from the corridor spilled into our sanctuary. We sprang apart, Isabella smoothing her dress in a panic, me turning toward the entrance, expecting to see my father's furious red face. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. But it wasn't Richard. Standing in the opening, holding the velvet curtain back with one hand and a glass of scotch in the other, was Mr. Sterling, my father's fiercest business rival. He was a shark of a man, silver-haired and sharp-eyed. He looked at me, flushed and disheveled, then at Isabella, whose lipstick was smudged and whose breathing was ragged. He didn't look shocked. He looked delighted. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face as he took a sip of his drink. Well, well, Sterling drawled, his eyes dancing with malicious amusement. I was looking for Richard to discuss the merger. But it seems his family is busy, merging on their own. He stepped fully into the box, letting the curtain fall shut behind him, trapping us with him. Don't worry, I won't tell him, Sterling said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that chilled my blood. At least, not until I decide what that information is worth. The drive back to the estate was a funeral procession of silence, the air in the limousine thick with the unspoken threat Mr. Sterling had left hanging over our heads like a guillotine blade. My father, Richard, was oblivious to the sword dangling by a thread. He was too busy pouring himself another drink and cursing the traffic, completely unaware that his rival now held the power to destroy his family with a single phone call. When we finally arrived at the manor, the house loomed against the night sky like a dark, stone judge. Richard immediately retreated to his study on the ground floor, muttering about making urgent calls to damage control whatever merger talk he had missed. I stood in the foyer, watching Isabella climb the stairs, her back stiff, her emerald dress rustling like dry leaves. She didn't look back. I should have gone to my room. I should have packed my bags and left the state. Instead, I walked into the library, the darkest, quietest room in the house, and poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a crystal glass, trying to drown the image of her fear-stricken eyes. I hadn't taken 2 sips when the heavy oak door creaked open. I froze, the glass halfway to my mouth. It wasn't Richard. Isabella slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her and turning the heavy iron key in the lock. She had changed. The armor of the green gown was gone, replaced by a sheer, ivory silk robe that ghosted over her frame like mist. She looked ethereal and shattered, a ghost haunting her own life. She walked toward me, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. He's on the phone with his lawyers, she whispered, her voice hollow. He won't come out for hours. Sterling must have called him already. Or he will. She stopped in front of me, taking the glass from my hand and downing the rest of the whiskey in one burn. She slammed the glass onto the mahogany desk, the sound loud in the stillness. I'm ruined, Daniel. If Sterling talks. Richard won't just divorce me. He'll destroy me. I signed a prenup that leaves me with nothing but the clothes on my back if there's infidelity done. I won't let him hurt you, I said, though I knew the promise was flimsy against my father's wealth. I'll tell him it was me. I'll tell him I forced it. Isabella looked at me, a sad, weary smile touching her lips. She reached out and touched my face, her fingers cool against my flushed skin. You'd throw away your inheritance for me? For a stepmother you barely know? I know enough, I answered, leaning into her touch. I know that you're lonely. I know that you're drowning in this house. And I know that I don't care about the money anymore. It was the truth. The fear of Sterling, the looming scandal, it had clarified everything. The social currency my father valued so highly was worthless compared to the way she looked at me. Then we have nothing left to lose, she breathed, her eyes darkening. If we're going to be punished for a crime, Daniel, Let's make sure we actually commit it. She stepped back and untied the sash of her robe. The silk parted, sliding off her shoulders and pooling on the floor, leaving her standing in the moonlight filtering through the high arched windows. She was completely bare, bathed in silver light, a vision of absolute, terrified beauty. The sight of her stopped my heart. This wasn't the stolen, frantic touching of the car or the opera box. This was a deliberate surrender. I crossed the distance between us, crashing into her, lifting her up onto the edge of the heavy oak desk, scattering papers and pens. The library, with its smell of old leather and dust, became the sanctuary for our collapse. We moved with a desperate, starving intensity, driven by the knowledge that the clock was ticking. Every kiss was a goodbye, every touch a memory we were trying to burn into our skin before the world tore us apart. The looming threat of exposure didn't dampen the desire. It acted like gasoline. We were burning down the house from the inside, and the flames were magnificent. We were lost in the haze of it, my shirt unbuttoned, her legs wrapped around me, the silence of the room filled only with our ragged breathing, when the sound of reality shattered our world. Creak. It was the distinct, high-pitched groan of the floorboard in the hallway. The one right outside my father's study. We froze. Isabella's nails dug into my shoulders. We held our breath, straining to hear over the pounding of our own blood. Thump, thump, thump. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps. They weren't going upstairs. They were coming down the hall, toward the library. "He's coming," Isabella whispered, her voice terrified. "He saw the light under the door." Panic, cold and sharp, washed over us. We scrambled apart. Isabella snatched up her robe, her hand shaking so badly she couldn't find the armholes. I frantically tried to button my shirt, my fingers clumsy and numb. There was no time. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. The handle jiggled. Locked. "Daniel?" Richard's voice came through the wood, muffled but suspicious. "Isabella? Is someone in there?" "Hide," Isabella hissed, shoving me toward the heavy velvet drapes that covered the bay window. "Get behind the curtain. Don't breathe." "What about you?" I whispered, looking at her disheveled hair and the robe she was barely holding closed. "I'll handle him," she said, grabbing a book from the nearest shelf and throwing herself into the large wingback chair facing the fireplace, angling it away from the door. "Just stay hidden." I dove behind the thick burgundy velvet just as the lock clicked. Richard had the master key. Of course he did. The door swung open, casting a wedge of yellow hallway light into the dim room. Through the small gap in the curtains, I watched my father step into the library. He was wearing his reading glasses, holding a tumbler of scotch. He looked around the room, squinting into the shadows. "Isabella?" he asked, spotting her in the chair. "Why is the door locked? And why are you sitting in the dark?" Isabella turned a page of the book she was holding upside down. "I was reading, Richard," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I locked it because I didn't want to be disturbed. I have a migraine." Richard huffed, walking further into the room. He stopped near the desk. He looked down at the scattered papers. Then he looked at the floor. My heart stopped. Lying on the Persian rug, right in the center of the patch of moonlight, was my silk tie. I had taken it off moments ago and dropped it. It was bright blue. Unmistakable. Richard bent down and picked it up. He held the tie up to the moonlight, dangling it from his finger like a dead snake. He turned slowly toward Isabella, his expression hardening into cold, lethal realization. "You're reading in the dark," he said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "With a migraine. And yet, Daniel's tie is on the floor." He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the corners, finally resting on the slight bulge in the velvet curtains where I was standing. "Is there something you want to tell me, darling? Or should I ask the drapes?" The silence that stretched between my father's question and my movement was thin and brittle, like ice about to shatter under the weight of a truck. Richard stood there, the blue silk tie dangling from his hand, his eyes bored into the burgundy velvet that concealed me. I had a split second to decide. Stay hidden and let him rip the curtain back, exposing me like a cowering child, or step out and try to control the narrative of my own destruction. I chose the latter. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the trembling in my legs, and pushed the heavy fabric aside. I stepped into the dim light of the library, my shirt unbuttoned halfway down my chest, my hair a mess, my face flushed. I didn't look at Isabella. I looked straight at Richard, raising my hands in a gesture of surrender. "You don't have to ask the Drapes, Dad," I said, my voice raspy but surprisingly steady. "I'm right here." Richard didn't scream. He didn't lunge at me. He simply stared, his face twisting into a mask of cold, sneering disappointment that hurt worse than a punch. He looked at the whiskey bottle on the desk, the one Isabella and I had ignored, and then back at my disheveled appearance. He connected the dots, but he drew the wrong picture. "Hiding behind curtains," he spat, tossing my tie onto the floor with disgust. "Drunk in my library while I'm trying to save this family from ruin. Is this how you handle pressure, Daniel? You steal my scotch and cower in the dark?" He turned to Isabella, who was clutching her book like a shield, her knuckles white. "And you," he growled. "You let him stay in here? You covered for him?" Isabella didn't miss a beat. She stood up, pulling her robe tighter, assuming the role of the exasperated stepmother. "He was upset about the gala, Richard. He was making a scene. I was trying to quiet him down before he woke the staff. I didn't want you to see him like this." It was a brilliant, seamless lie. She had handed him a narrative that fed his ego and confirmed his low opinion of me. Richard let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. "Pathetic," he muttered, shaking his head. "Both of you. Get out of my sight, Daniel. Go to your room and sleep it off. We'll discuss your future, if you still have one, in the morning." I walked past him, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought he would hear it. I didn't look at Isabella, but as I passed the chair, I felt the air shift between us, a silent vibration of shared relief and lingering terror. I walked out of the library, up the grand staircase, and into my room, locking the door behind me. I slid down against the wood, burying my face in my hands, laughing silently, hysterically, into the dark. We had stared into the barrel of a gun, and the chamber had clicked empty. Richard thought I was a drunk, a disappointment, a failure. He had no idea that while he was shouting about scotch, the taste of his wife was still on my lips. The danger hadn't broken us. It had forged us into co-conspirators. We were no longer just lovers. We were partners in a crime that was unfolding right under his nose. The next morning, the sun flooded the breakfast terrace with a cheerful, mocking brightness. The birds were singing, the coffee was hot, and the terror of the previous night felt like a fever dream. Richard sat at the head of the glass table, reading the Financial Times, looking crisp and untouched by the chaos. I sat to his right, wearing a fresh shirt, nursing a black coffee. Isabella sat opposite me, wearing a high-neck white blouse and sunglasses, looking like the picture of untouchable elegance. "I've made a decision," Richard announced, not looking up from his paper. The rustle of the newsprint sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning. "I can't have you moping around here, Daniel. You're a distraction. I'm sending you to the London office. You leave on Tuesday. The discipline will do you good." My stomach dropped. London was 4,000 miles away. It was exile. I opened my mouth to argue, to beg, but Isabella spoke first. "That won't be possible, Richard," she said smoothly, buttering a piece of toast with deliberate, calm movements. Richard lowered the paper, staring at her over his reading glasses. "Excuse me? I said no," Isabella repeated, taking a sip of her tea. She lowered her sunglasses, looking him dead in the eye. "I've already assigned Daniel to oversee the renovation of the West Wing and the gardens. The contractors start Monday. I need someone here I trust to watch them, since you're always at the office. Unless you want to manage the construction crew yourself?" It was a power play. She was using his own negligence against him. Richard stared at her, jaw tightening. He looked at me, then back at her. He weighed the inconvenience of managing a renovation against the annoyance of having me around. Laziness won. "Fine," he grunted, snapping the paper back up. "But if the budget goes over by 1 cent, it comes out of his inheritance. Do what you want. Just keep him out of my way." He finished his coffee in silence, stood up, and walked out to his waiting car without a backward glance. The engine roared, tires crunched on gravel, and then silence. We were alone. Isabella let out a long breath, her shoulders dropping as the tension left her frame. She didn't smile. She stood up and walked around the table to where I was sitting. She stood behind my chair, placing her hands on my shoulders, her fingers digging into the muscle. He wanted to send me away, I whispered, reaching up to cover her hand with mine. He doesn't get to decide anymore, she replied, her voice low and fierce. She leaned down, her lips brushing my ear, sending shivers down my spine. You're staying right here. The West Wing is empty, Daniel. It has its own entrance, its own keys. And the contractors, well, they won't be coming for weeks. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled out a small, heavy object. She slid it across the glass table toward me. It wasn't a key to the West Wing. It was a small, silver zipper pull, the tab she had snapped off her green dress the night of the gala. A trophy. A promise. Finish your coffee, she said, walking toward the French doors leading to the house, her hips swaying with a new, dangerous confidence. She paused at the threshold, looking back at me over her shoulder, the morning sun catching the gold in her hair. The garden needs inspecting. Meet me behind the hedge maze in 10 minutes. And Daniel? Don't be late.